Section 47 of From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse. Edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Homecoming of Ulysses, retold from the Odyssey of Homer. I sing of Ulysses, the hero who in manhood's prime fared forth with all the mighty men of Greece to conquer Troy. 10 long years he spent in labor to reduce that little to be honored city that harbored thieving Paris, and when that work was done, still 10 years more must wander o'er the deep, laboring to bring his comrades safely home, and longing ever in his heart of hearts for his own fireside and Penelope, his dear beloved wife, and sweet Telemachus, his little son. Oft was he tempest-tossed and cast upon strange, savage shores where hideous monsters lurked, lured now by sweet-voiced sirens to destruction on the rocks, tempted now by eaters of that sleepy lotus flower, to waste his days in lazy, idle dreams. And when he had o'erpassed these dangers and temptations all, shipwrecked at last through disobedient folly of his men, and born sole survivor of them all, clinging to a battered mast up on the shores of fair Calypso's isle. Now the bright-haired nymph Calypso found the storm-worn hero half washed up upon the beach. She drew him into safety, and led him to the grotto where she dwelt. A lovely spot it was, hid far within a depth of greenery where birds were ever singing. A vine with glistening leaves and clustering purple grapes crept all over the cliff without. About grew alders, poplars prim, and cypresses of resinous fragrance. Hard by, from out the rocks, 4 crystal-clear springs gushed sparkling forth, and everywhere about the meadows bloomed with fairest wildwood blossoms. Here in joy and plenty Calypso entertained Ulysses, and Ulysses was at first full grateful and content. But as the days passed by, within his heart awoke the longing to be once more on his way to Ithaca, Penelope, and home. Yet by this time Calypso of the amber hair had grown to love that wise, large-hearted hero, and had no mind ever to let him leave her more. So she sought to charm his fancy and lull him to forgetfulness of home, nor would she lend her aid to find him any boat or craft wherein he might once embark upon the deep. Then went Ulysses to the craggy rocks that edged the shore, and there sat sorrowing all alone, gazing with tear-wet eyes far off across the sea, wishing for a well-oared galley to fly swift before the wind, longing, yearning to be home. And now for aught the bright-haired nymph might do she could not turn him from his purpose. While thus Ulysses yearned and sorrowed on Calypso's isle, in high Olympus met the gods who guide the affairs of men, and Pallas Athene, light of wisdom unto humankind, and ever protectress of the sage Ulysses, mindful of all the hero's woes, pleaded his cause to that high thundering Jove, her father, ruler of storms and mighty king of heaven. And Father Jove, moved by her words, from his high throne of power, sent Hermes, his dear son and messenger of the gods, to that fair nymph Calypso, to bid her, under pain of his severe displeasure, aid Ulysses in the building of a raft, and leave him free to start once more upon his journey home. Hastily Hermes bound upon his feet his golden sandals that bore him over land and ocean like the wind, and down he plunged unto the deep, skimming its surface like a hovering sea-mew that often lightly dips her pinions in the brine. But when he reached Calypso's cave, he found the nymph within. A fire burned brightly on the hearth, and far was wafted o'er the isle the fragrant smoke of cloven cedar burning in the flame, and cypress wood. Meanwhile, in her recess, she sweetly sang, as busily she threw the golden shuttle through the web she wove. Perceiving Hermes coming, Calypso bade him welcome, and placed him graciously upon the shining seat of state within her grotto. Then said Hermes, Nymph, Jove bids thee send Ulysses hence with speed, for here he must not perish, far from all he loves. Obey, for well thou knowest, neither God nor man hath power to withstand Jove. Then with winged words Calypso wailed her lot, but since in truth none could withstand the purposes of Jove, at last she wielded up her will to his wise ordering and promised to obey. She sought Ulysses out and told him how she meant to give him means to build a raft, with bread and wine and water to provision it, that he might leave her happy isle if he so chose. But she cautioned him if he knew but through what great dangers he must pass, not all his longing for Penelope and home would ever lead him forth to face them all. But that great-hearted hero, not for an instant to be turned aside from his firm purpose, said, "Let come what will, I go. For in my bosom dwells a mind, patient of suffering. Much have I endured, and much survived, in tempests on the deep, and in the battle let this happen too." Now when the child of dawn, Aurora, rosy-fingered, looked abroad, Ulysses donned his mantle, and the nymph, robed all in delicate silver white, with a fair golden girdle at her waist, and on her head a filmy veil, made ready to aid the hero in his labors. She gave him first an axe and adze, and led him to that corner of the woods where grew the tallest trees. 20 tall trees Ulysses felled, and squared their trunks, and smoothed their sides, and wrought them by the line. Then he fitted these together, and made them fast with nails and clamps. Upon the massy beams he reared a deck, and floored it with long planks. On this he raised a mast, and fitted to the mast a yard. He shaped a rudder next, and fenced the raft with woven work of willow boughs, to guard her sides against the dashings of the sea. Then Calypso brought him ropes and canvas, wherewith he rigged a sail, and thus, his vessel all complete, he launched her in the deep. On the 5th day the nymph gave him to put on board a skin of dark red wine, and one of water, and a basket stored with choicest viands. So Ulysses bade her graciously farewell, the nymph with amber hair, and spread his canvas joyfully to catch the breeze. For 17 days he fared in safety on his craft, till the Phaeacian shores came full in sight, where it had been foretold his sorrows should be ended. But now great Neptune, ruler of the sea, who held Ulysses ever in enmity, saw him at last about to escape the dangers of his realm, and burning with fierce wrath, he urged his coursers with fair flowing manes on through the deep to where Ulysses stood. He spake, and round about him called the clouds, and roused the ocean, wielding in his hand the trident, summoned all the hurricanes of all the winds, and covered earth and sky at once with mists, while from above the night fell suddenly. From on high a huge and frightful billow broke, whirling the raft around, and washing Ulysses from the deck. A fierce rush of all the winds together snapped the mast in twain, the yard and canvas flew far off into the deep. The billow held the hero long beneath the waters, but struggling through the waves at last, he reached his battered craft and sprang once more on board. As thus he clung in such a woeful case, a delicate-footed nymph beheld him, and, filled with pity, rose up from the deep, perching on his raft, in form a great white bird. "Let go thy raft," she cried, "cast thyself into the sea, and swim for the Phaeacian shore. Take this, my veil, bind it across thy breast, and fear no danger. When thou hast reached the land, fling then my veil far out to sea." The nymph, thus speaking, vanished, and Ulysses bound the veil about his breast obediently, then plunged into the deep. 2 days and nights among the stormy waves he floated, but on the 3rd day reached a rocky shore, beetling on high with crags and walls of rock. Against this he had been crushed to death, had not Pallas Athene ever informed his mind with wisdom how to save himself. So he came at last upon a smooth and quiet shore within a little cove, and crept up on the beach, whence, when he had regained his breath from that long struggle, he flung the good nymph's veil as she had ordered, far, far out to sea. Then on a height above a little stream that poured its tranquil waters, There into the mighty ocean he found a pleasant wood, wherein he entered, and heaping up a couch of leaves, flung down his wearied limbs, and slept. Now while Ulysses thus found fitting rest, Pallas Athene, meaning that he should be found by those well able to save him, appeared within the gorgeous chamber where slept Nausicaa, fair daughter of the large-souled king Alcinous of Phaeacia. Assuming the shape of one of this young virgin's maids, Ulysses' fair protectress said, Nausicaa, has then thy mother brought forth a careless housewife? Thy marriage day is not far off, and yet the garments thou hast all prepared have not been washed. Tomorrow with the dawn let us make suit to thine illustrious father, that he bid his mules and car be harnessed, to convey thy girdles, robes, and mantles to the washing place, where we will wash them clean. Nausicaa, thus prompted, arose with the bright morning light, and went to seek her parents. She found her mother by the hearth, turning her distaff midst her maids, her father on the threshold, going forth to meet his chiefs in council. Modestly the maiden proffered her request, and soon, obedient to the king's command, servitors made ready in the outer court the strong-wheeled chariot, and led the harnessed mules beneath the yoke. Into the polished car Nausicaa and her maidens gaily piled the shining garments, while the good queen mother filled a hamper full of pleasant meats and flavored morsels for the day's repast. Then Nausicaa lightly climbed into the car, seized the scourge and shining reins, and urged the good mules forward, while her maidens trooped with merry laughter round the wain. Now when they reached the river's pleasant brink, where lavers had been hollowed out in which to do the washing, they loosed the mules to browse upon the grass, and took the garments out. Flinging these into the water, they trampled them with hasty feet, in frolic rivalry, as was the manner then of washing. And when the task was done, and all the garments cleansed, they spread them out along the beach to dry wherever the stream had washed the gravel cleanest. Then, in sportive mood, they bathed themselves within the river, splashing sparkling jets of spray into one another's faces, mischievous in mimic battle. Once more clothed in their light robes, they spread their noonday meal upon the grass beside the river's brink, and ate of it with buzz of busy conversation. When thus they were refreshed, mistress and maids cast their veils aside, and all began to play at ball. Now here, now there, the little ball went flying through the air, while all those lithe and graceful figures leapt and swayed and bounded, twinkling in the light. At length, white-armed Nausicaa cast her ball at one of her handmaidens, but the ball missed of its aim, went far beyond the maid, and fell into the whirling eddy of the stream. Then all those pretty players shrieked aloud, and at that sound Ulysses was awakened from his sleep. Arising from his couch of leaves, he came forth from the thicket, and at unexpected sight of such a wild and uncouth stranger, the maidens fled, shrieking once again to right and left. White-armed Nausicaa only kept her place, for Pallas gave her courage. Then Ulysses came no nearer, lest he frighten her, but told her of his shipwreck and his woes, beseeching pity, and begging that she give him some old robe wherein to wrap himself, and lead him to the city. Much moved, Nausicaa bade her maids return, and said, This man comes to us, a wanderer and unhappy, and to him our cares are due. The stranger and the poor are sent by Jove, and slight regards to them are grateful. Then she bade the maids bring him a cloak and tunic, and a cruse of oil, and leave him there to cleanse and clothe himself. And when Ulysses had washed the salt spray of ocean from his back, anointed all his limbs with oil, and donned the garments she had given, he appeared of such a stately size and such majestic mien that fair Nausicaa knew his tale could be but true. She bade him follow her until they came nigh unto the town, and then, lest men should jeer at seeing him, a man, amidst her crowd of maids, she bade him wait within a little poplar grove outside the walls, till she should have a time to reach her home. Thereafter he should come alone unto her father's palace. Obedient to her wish, when she had mounted to her wain, that now was loaded with the good day's work, he followed with the maidens all on foot. But at the poplar grove he left the joyous crowd, nor took his own way forward till Nausicaa long had been at home, her mules unharnessed and her wain unladen. At the city gate, as he approached alone, Pallas Athene met Ulysses in the guise of a young maiden with an urn, and led him to the palace, casting over him a cloud of darkness, so that no rude dwellers in the city should do him any harm. Now the Phaeacians were expert with oar and sail, and loved not so much as masts and shrouds, and as he went his way, Ulysses saw, wondering, the haven and the gallant ships, the marketplace where heroes thronged the halls, long, lofty, and beset with palisades. So he arrived at last before the splendid palace of Alcinous, and that friendly veil of darkness sheltered him from curious eyes until he came where sat the royal pair, Alcinous and his queen, and falling clasped the good queen's knees. Then only was the veil withdrawn and the great hero visible. He poured out once again all his sad tale. "O great Alcinous," he begged, "send me once more to Ithaca, my home." A great-souled man Alcinous was. He raised the hero, promised him protection, and seating him upon a silver-studded throne, saw to it that he was most honorably entertained, the while the queen, recognizing such garments as he wore, learned how he had come by them, and delighted in her daughter's goodness. At daybreak, King Alcinous led Ulysses to the marketplace beside the harbor filled with ships. Thither came, too, all the Phaeacian chiefs, and when Alcinous had made known to them how this nameless stranger sought their aid to take him to the home from which he had so long been absent, it was agreed that all should feast together in his honor that day, whereafter they would load the suppliant with gifts, and in one of their own galleys send him home. There followed then within the palace a splendid feast, with singing of the blind Demodocus, bard of the silver tongue, and feats of wrestling, running, discus throwing, wherein Ulysses much excelled, and graceful dancing of the lithe-limbed youths. When this was done, the good Phaeacians loaded down their guest with gifts. He paid his grateful thanks unto Nausicaa and the king and queen, and was conveyed aboard a well-oared galley. Phaeacian rowers bore him on across the deep to Ithaca, and while he slept, they set him and his treasure both on shore, and left him in a sheltered bay, without awaiting any thanks. There, when he awoke and found himself alone, Ulysses loudly wailed his lot, not knowing that he stood on his own native soil. But unto him appeared once more Pallas Athene. She told him that this spot was his beloved Ithaca, and promised to protect him still. For during those long years that he had been away, his true and faithful wife Penelope had been beset by insolent suitors who sought against her will to make her marry one of them, and while thus they willed, they filled the hero's palace hall with revellings, and lived in riotous extravagance upon Ulysses' beeves and swine and wine, consuming all his substance in their sure belief that he, Ulysses, king of Ithaca, had long been dead and gone, and would never more return to punish them. Penelope the faithful sought to put them off and hold her own against them, for she sorrowed ever for Ulysses, and in her loyal heart she never yielded up the hope that her dear husband would one day come home. Her son Telemachus had grown to manhood, had gone forth into the world to seek some certain news of his beloved father, but the suitors hated him, the son, knowing full well how that he used his inheritance to keep his mother from yielding to their suit. And now they planned to lie in wait for him when he returned, and slay him. All this all-knowing Pallas told Ulysses. In beggar's guise, she bade, thou shalt seek out thy faithful swineherd, and in his hut plan how to rid thyself of those proud suitors. She then transformed the hero to a squalid beggar, wrapped in rags, and having first assisted him to hide his treasure in a cave, she left him to go on his way alone. The faithful swineherd, though he did not recognize his master under this disguise, received the ragged stranger with a simple courtesy and kindliness, and served him with his best, talking meanwhile of his great love for his departed master, and complaining how the greed of those insistent suitors was depleting all Ulysses' flocks and herds. While thus Ulysses spent the night with his old servant, Pallas appeared unto Telemachus, where he slept in Sparta, on his voyage seeking news, and in his heart awakened the desire for home, warning him of the suitor's plan to slay him, and instructing him how he might save himself. With the morning, Telemachus embarked at once and sailed for Ithaca, descending from his boat, as Pallas bade, near to the swineherd's hut, and sending on his galley, lacking him for whom the suitor lay in wait, so that their ambush would prove vain. At early dawn Ulysses and the swineherd were preparing food for breakfast, when Ulysses saw a youth approach the lodge, on whom the fierce dogs, wont to bark at strangers, fawned affectionately. As he came within the hut, the swineherd greeted him full lovingly as his young master, good Telemachus, and begged that he would occupy the place of honor at his table. But this Telemachus most modestly declined in favor of the aged stranger, to whom, in spite of his poor rags, he showed much honor, promising him protection and whole clothes as soon as he should be the master in his house. Then Telemachus bade the swineherd go in secret to his mother Penelope, and tell her of his safe arrival home. No sooner was the old man gone than Pallas, appearing unto Ulysses where he walked alone outside the swineherd's lodge, transformed him once again into his own radiant self in fitting garments. "Disclose now thy true identity unto thy son," she said, "and plan with him right means for dealing with these insolent suitors." Thus advised, Ulysses told Telemachus that he was none but that great sufferer, his long-lost father, and that the youth, impetuous, threw his arms about him, shedding tears of joy, the while Ulysses kissed his son, and from his eyelids too, though long restrained, the tears fell to earth. Their first transports of joy at this reunion past, Ulysses bade his son go to the palace and there await the arrival of his father. Later in the day, Ulysses, once more the sordid beggar, unrecognized by all, was led by that true faithful swineherd to the palace, and there arrived just as the suitors' wonted revels reached their height, filling all the court with noise and song. Alone he stood before the walls that once had owned him master, and while enemies made joy about his board, none knew him. Ulysses, none there was to care for him of all those whom he once had so benignly ruled, none save his old hunting dog, cast out now as grown old and useless on the dust heap. That tried and trusty friend knew his dear master, spite of all disguise, crept up, and greeted him with one last flicker of joy, and then fell lifeless to the earth. An unseen tear Ulysses dropped on the dear head of that one friend, then entered into the palace. When he stood within the doors of that vast hall, filled full of enemies, Ulysses humbly bowed his head and made the round of all the suitors, begging aid of each to try his spirit. None there received him kindly, save Telemachus. The suitors, each more insolent than the other, heaped insult upon insult on his head, and one, Antinous, flung a footstool at him. So angered was Penelope by this act that she herself came down to make apology to the stranger, and courteously inquire if he by chance had heard aught of Ulysses. Ah, to Ulysses how dear was that first sight of his beloved wife! How like sweet music fell her voice upon his ear, albeit, like the rest, she knew him not, save for her and Telemachus, and one old faithful nurse who pieced through the disguise. Ulysses met that night with naught but great discourtesy in his own house, where those proud suitors, swarming like an army, invaded all the place. Yet, in despite of all their swarming, Ulysses and Telemachus found means in secret to remove all weapons from the hall, where they held sway. On the morrow, Pallas awoke in the mind of sage Penelope the design to bid her suitors contend for her by means of that gigantic bow that once had been Ulysses's, aiming to shoot an arrow through 12 rings. He who should perform that feat should have her for his bride. To this proposal the suitors eagerly agreed. Thus, armed with that great weapon, Penelope appeared within the banquet hall, followed by handmaidens bearing string and arrows. First, Antinous strove to string the bow, in vain. He could not even so much as bend it. Then followed another suitor at the trial, and still another. Not one among them all could bend it. While thus they tried, Ulysses told the astonished swineherd who he was, and having laid his plans with care, when all his enemies had failed to span the bow, he himself stepped boldly forward, offering to perform the feat. What laughter, gibes, and ridicule met such an offer from a ragged beggar? But Ulysses seized the weapon, spanned it on the instant, and sent his first shaft through the rings, all 12. At that, a silence fell upon the multitude, who looked on, thunderstruck. Turning his weapon full upon his insolent foes, Ulysses grimly said that his next arrow had another goal, and through the heart he shot the false Antinous, in the very act to lift aloft a splendid 2-eared goblet full of good Ulysses' wine. Then followed what a conflict! But the suitors, heedless of aught but reveling, had neglected to provide themselves with weapons. Telemachus sprang to his father's side. The doors were shut and guarded close by that good swineherd, so none might escape, and thus returning day saw not a single one of those thieving revellers left, leech-like to suck his substance from Ulysses. That self-same night, the good old nurse, who only among all the servitors had recognized Ulysses, announced the news of the great hero's safe return unto his glad retainers and Penelope, the faithful. Ulysses home again. Such news to that long-awaiting wife could scarce be credited, and going down to meet the stranger, still in beggarly attire, she could not well believe that here her husband stood once more. Ulysses then, longing for sweet dawn of recognition in her eyes, proposed that all should purify themselves and sit to feast together. The while he cleansed and clothed himself, Pallas Athene once more returned him to his own fair form. And when Penelope beheld him thus, she fell upon his neck in deepest joy, and he, so long, lone wanderer o'er the earth, wept grateful tears, as in his arms once more he held his dearly loved and faithful wife. And thus Ulysses came into his own again, to rule his people with the same benignity and wisdom that was there before, or ever he left the Ithacan shore to humble distant Troy. End of section 47. Section 48 of From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. A story of Rustem, the hero of Persia, retold from the Shahnameh from the Book of Kings, by Ferdowsi. In the days when the great chieftain Saum ruled over the province of Seistan, there was born unto him a son named Zal, who had hair as white as a lily, as white as a goose's wing, as white as the snows on the mountain tops. For that reason, though the child's form was straight as a cypress tree, his face and beauty shining like the moon, men laughed at the chieftain Saum, and Saum, the hero of many battles, fell conquered as any coward weakling before the taunts and scorn of men. On a night of storm and thunder, he gave commands that his helpless babe should be left to perish on a mountain top. Now on the border of Seistan, far from the homes of men, stands the mountain called Elburz. Its lofty crest towers up to meet the stars. Its sides are rocky cliffs, so steep that mortal foot hath never scaled them. Here, far, far beyond the reach of men, the Simurgh has her nest, the giant bird, the bird of marvel. Of shining ebony, black as night, and fragrant sandalwood, that nest was builded. Around its base the cliffs were thickly veined with golden quartz, and gleamed with rubies, topaz, opals, brilliant stones of fire. From out the swirling banners of storm, a voice addressed the bird of God, and bade her save the babe. Sweeping down, she took him gently in her talons, and bore him to her nest, there to warm him with her own dear nestlings under her tender golden wings. In her lofty eyrie the Simurgh brought the babe to boyhood. Many a time, at her request, he sprang upon her mighty back, and was borne in free and glorious flight, up to the golden moon, in and out amongst the silvery stars, till he knew all the wonders of the heavens, then sweeping down over all the earth, till he knew all the wisdom of men. But the time came when the lonely Saum repented sorely what he had done, so that even the remembrance of his deeds of valor was but as dust in his nostrils. Then he went to Mount Elburz, bound his son, now grown a youth, bowed his head to the earth before him, and besought him to return unto Seistan. With grief and tenderness, the silver-crowned one bade his foster-mother farewell, and went back home with Saum. A mighty hero he grew to be, to gladden his father's heart. But the greatest moment in all his life was that wherein the bird of wisdom, the all-knowing bird of God, brought unto him and his fair bride Rutabe a son, a splendid boy, whom they called Rustem, which meaneth delivered. For, said the wise men, while he liveth will he ever stand between Persia and her foes. Now the child was as fair as a nosegay of lilies and tulips, and of marvelous strength. At news of his coming, the whole land of Iran was given over to feasting and rejoicing. Everywhere flowers were flung unto the streets, gay Persian carpets were hung from the balconies, and young and old came forth to sing and dance with mirth and music. But the great Saum himself was away at this time, fighting the Deevs of Mazinderan, so his son sent swift messengers on wind-footed dromedaries, bearing unto him a likeness of Rustem, worked in silk, representing the babe on a horse, armed like a warrior and carrying a cow-headed mace. When the old champion beheld this image, he was overwhelmed with delight, and returned thanks at once unto Ormuzd for this splendid gift to his house. The boy waxed daily in strength and intelligence, but not until he was 8 years old might the eyes of Saum be gladdened by the sight of his wonderful grandson. Then, when Saum returned from his wars, Rustem went forth to meet him in the midst of a bodyguard mounted on coal-black steeds, with golden maces and battle-axes gleaming in the sun, while lords and nobles of the land with waving plumes and splendid banners followed in gaily decked howdahs, borne on the backs of elephants, to the squealing of fifes, the blare of trumpets, clash of cymbals, and beating of drums. When Rustem beheld his illustrious grandsire approaching, he dismounted as was meet, and humbly approached on foot, pausing before his elephant, and bowing reverently to the ground. Beholding the youth, Saum was struck dumb with wonder and joy, for he saw that not half had been told him as to the boy's stature and grace. Filled with delight, the old warrior blessed his grandson, and bade him ascend into the howdah beside him. Thus the two rode together unto Zabulistan, and Rustem said unto Saum, O my grandsire, I rejoice to be grandson to much a doer of deeds as thou, for mine own desires are not after pleasure, neither do I think of play, nor rest, nor sleep, but ever and always I long to be a hero, performing deeds of valor, defeating those demons of darkness, the Deevs, saving Persia from her foes. And most of all, now I crave a horse of mine own, and a helmet and a coat of mail. Now Saum was delighted with these words, and ere he left the house of Zal again to go forth to battle, and said, Remember, my silver-crowned son, when this child's stature equals thine, he is to have a horse of his own choosing, and all the trappings thereto. Honor this as my parting command. Short and full were the days of Rustem's childhood, filled with many a deed of valor, and he was still but a lad in years, when the great day came, whereon Saum decreed he had earned the right to choose his own horse, as had been promised. Accordingly, a proclamation was sent out to all the provinces of Persia, commanding that upon the first day of the approaching festival of roses, all the choicest horses in the land should be brought to Zabulistan, and Rustem might choose from among them. Soon the hills without the city grew white with the tents of traders from Kabul and the Afghan pasture lands, while hordes of half-wild Tartars in black sheepskin caps swarmed over the plains with their herds of dark-maned horses. Low-browed men from the Caspian, standing erect in their saddles, rode their lean-limbed animals at full speed beneath the city walls, and troops of high-spirited Arab coursers went prancing hither and yon in charge of a dignified sheik of the desert. On the morning of the Festival of Roses, when the meadows smiled with verdure, Filling all the air with fragrance, Zal and Rustem took their seats on a beautiful golden throne just without the western gate midst a throng of people gathered together to see the splendid show. One by one, the mettlesome steeds were led for inspection before the seat of Rustem. Proudly each master approached, but though many a horse was swift and beautiful and gentle, Rustem the powerful bore down the weight of his hand on each, and not one among them but sank to his haunches from force of that mighty pressure. Crestfallen, his master was forced to lead them away. Alas! So fared it with horse after horse, till keen disappointment filled the soul of Rustem, and he knew not what he should do to find a steed to bear him. But, letting his eye rove over the field in one last muster, behold! He suddenly spied beyond the tents of Kabul a mare and her foal, feeding quietly on the hillside. The mare appeared strong as a lioness, but it was the colt that held Rustem's eye, for its color was that of rose leaves scattered on a saffron ground. It appeared as strong as an elephant, as tall as a camel, as vigorous as a lion, and its eyes fairly beamed with intelligence. Seeing this, Rustem cried, "O sons of Kabul, unto whom belongeth yon splendid colt?" The herdsmen shook their heads gravely and answered, "Most gracious prince, we know not. All the way from the Afghan valleys the colt and his mother have followed us, and we could neither drive them back nor capture them. We have heard it said, however, that the name of the colt is Rakush, or lightning, because he is swift as a flash and his spirit is fire. Many have desired to possess him, but in vain. No man hath ever mounted him." No sooner had Rustem heard this than he seized a lariat from the nearest herdsman, ran quickly forward, and threw the noose without warning over the head of the startled colt. Then followed a furious tussle, not so much with the colt as with the frenzied mother. But lo, the son of Zal strove with such mighty strength that he soon drove the mare from the field. Then he pressed his hand with all his weight down on the colt's back, but Rakush did not even bend under it. So Rustem gave a glad cry, and caressing the creature, fondly said, "O Rakush, Rakush, verily thou shalt be my throne. Seated on thee I shall do great deeds, my beauty." So speaking, with a great bound, the young prince leaped upon his back, and rose-colored steed bore him over the plain with the speed of the wind. But at a single word from his master, Rakush turned and came quietly back to the city gates, where the vast crowd was mightily cheering. Then Zal said unto the herdsman, "Good herdsman, what wish ye in exchange for this steed?" But the herdsman, turning to Rustem, made answer gravely, "His price is the land of Persia. Mount him and give us in exchange Iran, delivered from her foes." Thus it was that Rustem won his good horse, Rakush, and ever after they two were fast in devotion, loving one another. Now the chief foes of Persia in those days were the Deevs, dark demons who dealt in sorcery. They walked upright like men, but had horns, long ears, and tails like beasts, and many were cat-headed. Some were small and black, but more were huge and gigantic, and ever the land where they dwelt was a place of illusions and magic. It took the heart of a hero to do battle with such as these. The Shah over all Persia at the time was one Koss, whose riches and power had so increased since he sat on the throne of light that he grew puffed up with self-admiration and pride, indulging more and more in the wine-cup, until in the midst of his luxury and feasting he beheld in all the world no man but himself. Then it came to pass one day, as the vain Shah sat in his trellised bower in a garden of roses, that a Deev, disguised as a minstrel and playing sweetly upon his harp, presented himself to the king's chamberlain, and with honeyed words sought entrance. Beguiled by the charm of the youth, the chamberlain hastened at once to the king to beg an audience for him. "O shelter of the universe," he said, "at thy gate is a minstrel with his harp, and lo, in his throat he hides a flock of singing birds that will make thy bower a paradise. He hath come hither desiring to prostrate himself before the King of Kings, the most illustrious of all the Shahs of Iran, and he awaiteth thy command, being naught but the dust beneath thy feet." The king, blinded by the flattery so that he perceived no guile, commanded the musician to be brought before him, and the youth, having made obeisance, began to sing of the enchanted land of the Genii. Now thus he warbled to the king, Mazinderan is the bower of spring. My native home, the balmy air, diffuses health and fragrance there. So tempered is the genial glow, nor heat nor cold we ever know. Tulips and hyacinths abound on every lawn and all around. Blooms like a garden in its prime, fostered by that delicious clime. The bulbul sits on every spray and pours his soft melodious lay. Each rural spot its sweets discloses, each streamlet is the dew of roses. The damsels idols of the heart sustain a most bewitching part. And mark me that untravelled man who never saw Mazinderan, and all the charms its bowers possess, has never tasted happiness. Now as the king's desire was to drain the cup of happiness to the dregs, no sooner had he heard the minstrel's lay of this enchanting land, than straightway he became inflamed with the desire to possess it for his own, and declared unto his warriors that they must set forth to conquer it at once. Alas! The nobles, when he heard these words of vanity and folly, grew pale with dread, for they had no desire to invade the country of the Deevs. But words were useless to restrain the Shah. Neither the wise counsel of the white-headed Zal would he heed, nor of any other noble. He boasted in answer that naught beneath the sun could withstand the prowess of Kaikous the mighty. Ere the week was out, the great army of Iran was in motion. The vainglorious king at its head, his magnificent retinue of richly caparisoned horses, camels, and elephants, making the earth tremble beneath their tread. So they marched, pitching their tents each night and passing the hours in revelry that ill became those about to do battle with evil. Then the king sent out his bravest warrior, Gu, while he himself remained encamped on the plain at a safe distance from the conflict, and he bade Gu break down the gates of the first city in Mazinderan, sparing no man, woman, nor child. So Gu advanced, and when he was come unto the city, he found it indeed arrayed in all the splendor of paradise, even as the minstrel had sung. Beauty, verdure, fragrance filled all the senses with delight, while gold and jewels glittered everywhere. In the streets were beautiful maidens richly adorned, with faces as bright as the moon. But Gu knew that all this beauty was but the illusion of sorcery, and that in truth the Deevs were ugly and foul. He was not, therefore, beguiled. Soon clubs rained down upon the Deevs like hail, and ere night had fallen, the city that had resembled a garden was become a heap of ruins. Kaikous was wild with elation at news of the victory that he had done naught to win, and more puffed up than ever with vanity, he gave command to plunder and pillage, taking thought of nothing at all, save only to slake his greed, and all unworthy the mighty victory over the powers of darkness, which he knew not how to turn to any good account. But over his foolish head hung the sword of vengeance, for the king of Mazinderan, hearing what had happened to one of his mighty cities, sent to the most dreaded and powerful magician in all the land, the great white Deev, and bade him destroy the men of Iran. And the great white Deev rose up in wrath and sent a heavy black cloud to envelop the drunken plunderers, causing stones and javelins to rain down on them out of the pitch-black sky. All was terror and confusion, nor could any man protect himself. By morning, who was not fled or dead was stricken stone blind, and among those latter Kaikous himself. Then came 12,000 genii to thrust the blind men into prison. And a voice called out, mocking unto Kaikous, Verily, O Shah, thou hast attained Mazinderan, which was thy heart's desire, wherefore be now content. Thus Kaikous dwelt in the land after which his heart had yearned, until, the eyes of his soul being opened in genuine repentance, he bowed himself in the dust, casting black earth upon his head, and acknowledged his fault. Then, and then only, means appeared whereby he might send a messenger unto Zal. When the silver-crowned one heard the sorrowful news, he delayed not, but sent Rustem at once to the rescue. Clad in his tiger skin and iron helmet, With only his faithful steed for company, the young hero set forth on the perilous journey. Long and difficult was the way, and in many a sore extremity Rakush succored his master, saving him now from a lion, now from a dragon, keeping watch and ward over him while he slept, and cheering him ever with faithful comradeship and affection. So Rustem came at last out of a desert into the land of enchantment, and as everything here was illusion, everything seemed to the eye most beautiful. Feathered palms lazily nodded their heads, bananas flaunted their ribbon-like leaves over clusters of ripened fruit, and on the ground in rich profusion temptingly lay pomegranates, apricots, citrons. In the leaves overhead the nightingale sang, and lo! There suddenly appeared to the astonished sight of the hungry hero a table daintily spread with viands. Unsaddling Rakush and bidding him graze, Rustem sat down to break a long fast, but he ate full temperately and sang as he ate, "Oh, the scourge of the wicked am I, and my days still in battle go by. Not for me is the red wine that flows in the reveller's cup, nor the rose that blooms in the land of delight, but with monsters and demons to fight." As Rustem sang, his voice reached the ears of the wicked enchantress who had delayed him with the table, and changing herself into a beautiful maiden with the face of spring, she appeared unto him. Her skin was like shell-tinted ivory, her lips and cheeks like the pomegranate, her soft dark eyes curtained with long sweeping lashes, and her misty garments gave forth such a fragrance that they perfumed all the air. At her approach, Rustem was enraptured. She seemed like an houri from paradise, but minding the duties of hospitality, he extended to her a goblet, saying, "Drink in the name of Ormuzd." No sooner had he named the name of God than lo! That wicked sorceress changed color, becoming in a twinkling black as coal. Then Rustem knew her for no houri but a witch, and he snared her in his lasso, crying, "Wicked creature, show thyself in thy true shape." Whereon he held in his grasp naught but a leering, decrepit old woman. He smote at her with his sword, but she slipped from his hand and vanished with mocking fiendish laughter. Vanished too were the table and viands, and Rustem lingered no more, but saddled Rakush and went on his journey. Now he passed through a land of pitch-black darkness and impenetrable gloom, where he knew not what dangers might lurk on either hand, but, lifting up his heart unto Ormuzd for protection and guidance, he gave unto Rakush the rein and plunged boldly forward, emerging at length, thanks to the all-merciful One, into a most beautiful country where the sun was shining. Herein he found one Aulad, a chief, and pressed him into his service as guide, by whose aid he came at length to the fateful spot where Kaikous fell into the hands of the enemy. There he beheld the great camp of Arzang, mightiest of all the White Deev's chiefs, and Arzang came boastfully forth to meet him. But in Rustem's heart was neither boasting nor vanity, only sure confidence of the hero, who forgetteth himself and knoweth his cause is just. And he seized the mighty sorcerer like a puny worm in his grasp, and slew him and hurled him headlong into the ranks of his own shuddering Deevs, who, beholding the fate of their chief, fled one and all terror-stricken before the conqueror. Then Rustem paused not for a moment, but guided by Aulad, pressed on at once to the prison of Kaikous. Great was the joy of Kaikous and his comrades at their deliverance. They offered up thanks to Ormuzd, and showered upon Rustem their gratitude. But Kaikous counseled the young hero to proceed at once and slay the great White Deev in his lair in the 7 mountains, ere that sorcerer learned of his coming, and brought against him such a multitude of evil ones that not even Rustem could withstand him. And he told him that 3 drops of the White Deev's blood in their blinded eyes would recover sight to himself and his miserable companion. Thus exhorted, the son of Zal vaulted into a saddle, and Rakush bore him off like the wind. So they sped till they came unto the 7 mountains, dark and terrible, with frowning cliffs and beetling crags and yawning caverns, and everywhere about were crowded myriads of Deevs, fierce, black, and horrible beyond belief. Rustem was one against a multitude, yet he waited, wary and watchful, until the Deevs were lost in lazy noonday slumber, when he rushed so fiercely upon them, thundering his battle-cry, that in confusion of their stupid sleep, hundreds fell beneath his sword, while the rest fled panic-stricken into the depths of the earth. So Rustem advanced in safety to the lair of the great White Deev. But alas, alas, never in all his imaginings had he dreamed of a place so gloomy and foul, a cavern of pitchy blackness heavy with evil odors. Yet his heart was strong, and he knew no quaking of fear as he made his way forward. In the center of the cave he saw looming up out of the darkness a mighty shape which filled the whole breadth of the cavern, and he knew by its thunderous snoring that this was the white Div himself. Bold as a lion, Rustem shouted his battle cry and sprang at him. Thus suddenly aroused from slumber, the Div was terrible in his wrath. Uttering a hideous shriek, he rushed upon his foe, and they grappled in a struggle, the shock of which caused the very mountains to tremble. Many a time it seemed to Rustem that his last hour had surely come, but lifting up his heart to Ormuzd, and putting forth all his strength, he suddenly caught the huge Div in his arms, and by one supreme effort hurled him over a cliff to his death in the yawning chasm below. Then he possessed himself of some of the white Div's blood, and returning to Kaikous and his comrades, dropped it into their eyes, whereby the enchantment laid on them by the Div was done away, and they received again their sight. Great as was now the joy of the men of Iran, there still remained to be conquered the king of Mazinderan, who came thundering down upon them with a mighty army, both horse and foot. Long was the struggle with him, and many a champion among the magicians Rustem vanquished. Yet the tide of battle was still uncertain. Then Kaikous, changed now in heart by his sufferings from that vainglorious boaster who went forth against the Divs, clothed himself in robes of humility, and prostrated himself before Ormuzd, beseeching that the kingdom of light might triumph over the kingdom of darkness. And lo, by the evening the Divs were put to flight, and Rustem, pursuing, found the ugly king with his great boar neck and great boar tusks left all alone, and he challenged him to combat. Desperately fought the king, and coolly fought Rustem. In the end, Rustem raised his sword for such a stroke as would have slain the monster, but in the twinkling of an eye the sorcerer changed himself to a great mass of rock, before which Rustem stood baffled. Kaikous gave orders to all his strongest men to drag the rock to his throne. Not all their strength together could even so much as lift it. Then Rustem bent his sturdy back, lifted the rock in his mighty arms, and bore it to the Shah. As he cast it down before him, he cried, "Coward, come forth, or with my mace I will grind this stone to powder." Seeing this trick was useless, the sorcerer quickly made himself visible, and Kaikous, beholding how wicked was his aspect, ordered him off to immediate execution. Then Kaikous made Aulad, the guide, king over Mazinderan, after which, with great rejoicing, he and Rustem and all their men went home to Persia. So the tree of gladness blossomed once more in Iran, and because of his mighty victory over the kingdom of darkness, the name of Rustem stands blazoned among the stars. End of section 48. End of From the Tower Window of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller.